Hey there, I'm Christopher Schoenwald, and welcome to Life as a show intently focused on helping people find their professional pathway by exploring and unearthing the details of jobs from around the world. Hey, how are you doing? Before we get started today, I do have a favor to ask of all of you. I did start a channel over on YouTube in the last year and a half or so. And yeah, I'm really trying to promote that. And the reason being is I think the content that I'm putting out here, we're doing all right with some of these guests that are coming on. And I think it deserves to be put in front of more people. And one of the best ways, of course, of doing that is through a platform like YouTube. Now, if you do interact with these videos on YouTube, that algorithm loves it. And that's the only way that it knows to continually share that content, put it in front of more people. So yeah, I could be a little bit biased here, but I think, finding out about some of these careers is great for young people. It's great for mid-career professionals. If you have a second, head on over to YouTube, Life as a ... That's where you can find it. And yeah, like or subscribe. It would help a ton. All right, well, on with the show. I want to start with a bit of a thought exercise today. Think of some of the classic movies, maybe some of your favorites: Star Wars, Jurassic Park, E.T., Home Alone, Forrest Gump. Now, imagine some of those pivotal moments within those films and take away the music. That background music that's playing there in these critical moments within the film itself. Take away that music. How would that feel? How would it change things? Well, I got this sneaky suspicion that, yeah, it would change things dramatically. Well, my friends, that is the magic and artistry of a screen composer. And that's what we're going to dive in today, that profession. We're in for a treat because the guest is renowned for her work in screen composing. And in the conversation, we get into, the intricacies of that job, what it takes, how you get into it, some of the rewards, some of the challenges, amongst other things. Also, too, we dive into the weeds, some of the interactions between a screen composer and a director, how some of the actual composing takes place, the technology that's used. Furthermore, we also get into, the guest's unique background, which she shares a little bit about how that's helped her in her career. And towards the end of the show, we even get into topics such as technology and AI, how that may be shifting things around. So yeah, I think this conversation is going to be a great one for you to listen to. And yeah, I hope you like it. Janal Bechthold is a Canadian screen music award-winning composer for film, TV, games, and interactive media, known for weaving playful and dark moods with intelligence and emotional maturity. Now, her jam involves working on scores where music is integral to the storytelling experience, whether it embodies an invisible character, supports a heartfelt dramatic moment, or creates a horror jump scare or something quirky and fun. Janelle's professional achievements and awards are wide and varied. And here's but a sampling. Co-composing on the Emmy Award-winning Apple TV Plus show Ghostwriter, Canadian Screen Music Awards 2022 Best Original Score for Interactive Media, No Reason to Apologize, The Resilient Legacy of Viola Desmond. Also, Hollywood Music and Media Awards 2022 Music for New Media nominee, again for No Reason to Apologize, The Resilient Legacy of Viola Desmond. And those are the most recent, but let me assure you, Janelle and her work have been part of plenty more as far as awards and accolades go. Further, that truism of "you are who your friends are" might be an apt metaphor to really demonstrate the quality of her work. Janelle's contributions to productions involving the likes of Apple TV Plus, Sesame Workshop, Discovery Plus, National Geographic, and the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, CBC, should give an idea of the crowds her and her music hangs within. And to add, many of these productions have appeared all over the world, ranging from the Cannes Film Festival, United Nations Film Festival, Canadian Film Festival, and the LA Short Film Festival. All of this has amounted to her being labeled as a Canadian composer to watch. And as if all of that wasn't enough, she is an industry leader, having founded Toronto Women's Composers, is former second vice president and chair of the Women Composer Advisory Council to the Screen Composers Guild of Canada, served on the board of directors of the SOCAN Foundation, and spearheaded the 2018 research report, Gender in the Canadian Screen Composing Industry. So, with all of that stated, here's my conversation with Janal Bechthold. Yeah, hey, welcome to the show. How are you doing?
Good. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, really excited for this. I was saying in the pre-recording that as I researched for this episode, I found myself just getting more and more immersed into the world of what you do and all that it represents. And I just had all these questions that were just flowing. So yeah, I'm truly, truly excited to chat with you. So again, thanks for taking some time. I do have this first segment lined up for us already, something called Coloring Wikipedia. And as my listeners would know, it's basically a segment where I just read off a definition of what the guest does, sometimes their industry. And I do it for a couple of reasons. One, I think it, sets the stage for the conversation and it lets people know, broadly speaking, what the profession's all about. And the other thing too I find is that sometimes these definitions of what's provided about the profession itself aren't exactly hitting all the time. Sometimes they're overemphasizing certain elements, sometimes they're de-emphasizing. So I kind of like to approach it that way, just to hear it from somebody who's immersed in that world, obviously. So I do have you down here for composer for screen. Unfortunately, though, Wikipedia is letting us down. There actually is no entry for that profession. So I had to do a little bit internet sleuthing here, and I did find something from a UK-based website, DB's Institute of Sound and Technology. Okay, so I'm just going to read that off for you, and then after maybe you can comment. Does it sound okay?
Sounds great.
All right, here we go. Composer for screen. Composers for screen use music to enhance the mood and emotion for a range of visual mediums, including television, film, video games, advertising, and apps. They utilize their compositional experience alongside their recording and production expertise to produce music that not only edifies what is happening on screen, but also adds a new layer to the experience. All right. First take, what do you think of that, Jenna?
So that's actually a really good sort of overview. I think they hit a lot of things, especially both the creative side and the technical side of what a composer does. Because a composer for screen, you need to be able to write music. You also have to be able to write music that helps to tell a story and helps to bring the director's vision to life. That's the biggest thing. Whether it's the director or game developer or whoever you're working with, it's their story, it's their project, and so nobody wants a composer who self-expresses all over somebody, their project kind of
Right,
thing.
right.
But composer, essentially we have to wear many hats. So we're writing music, we're producing the music. Sometimes we're also the music editor. Sometimes we're also the musicians. Sometimes we're also, the accountant on our, for our small business. We're the, the janitor. We're the, things like that. We do.
Yeah.
There's a lot of things that we do that's not writing music, and I'm sure throughout the conversation, you'll get to hear more about some of those
Right.
things.
Right. Getting back to that point about, you know, trying to match or I guess produce something that's going to, align with the director's say vision. I'm guessing that could be a challenge at times, or maybe it depends on the person, the project, and whatnot. Like they're communicating something, but it's still like this gray area. At least again, from a layman's perspective here, I'm guessing like there must be a certain shade of gray in that where you're like they're communicating it, but are you interpreting it the way that they think they're communicating it across? What is that like?
Yeah, communication skills are so important in this industry because again, you're working with people that aren't musicians. And so they don't have the technical terms to use. They don't understand necessarily how to talk about music. And that's a really interesting thing because sometimes they know just enough to totally be like, they might know the words, but they just don't
Yeah,
know how to use them. Like I've
yeah,
had somebody be like, "Oh, yeah, you got to turn on that clarinet." There's no clarinet. So let's figure
yeah.
this out. But the process usually starts with a really important meeting called a spotting session, where you actually walk through the project and, step by step, where the music's going to go, where it stops, where it starts, and what is it going to say. And there's lots of conversations about tone, about pacing. Is the music going to help push the scenes forward? Are we going to add tension? What's the role of music? And I usually prefer if directors or producers or whoever I'm working with, if you think about emotional language, sort of like how you would coach an actor in terms of what is it that they're bringing. And of course, my background being music therapy is a little bit different because a lot of my training, both music and compositional, has been about how does music convey emotion. And so I look at all sorts of things in terms of how is as an audience going to experience the story, and how can I support them through that, or what is the character going through at this moment, and how can I heighten that. I did a project recently where the interesting thing was is that we had music, and then all of a sudden it's like we wanted the character to be really, really lonely and sort of pull away all that emotional support. And that was such a powerful thing. So
Yeah.
sometimes knowing when not to use music is also very important. So that's all part of the spotting session discussion with a director.
I think like from a layman's perspective, like you just assume that okay, you're putting music together, like the director wants something that's uplifting, okay, and you produce something that's uplifting. And like obviously it's much, much more complex. And what you're just explaining there kind of illustrates that point. It's a lot of this communication back and forth. It's knowing what type of music to put together. It's just finding that, that vision of what the director wants and then filling those gaps, I suppose. But then also it's just like a lot of feeling involved there, and then integrating your unique background to music therapy, that layer as well into it. It's just, yeah, I'm sure we're going to get into all of this later on in the conversation, but yeah, I just want to throw that in there again. I mean, it's just absolutely compelling to me. But getting back to the definition before we move on, was there anything that you would, I don't know, like to add to it or perhaps de-emphasize?
I would say that composers are also problem solvers.
I like that.
So I mean, a lot of times it's about the creative work and things like that, but sometimes it's about, the project needs something that's not there. So whether or not they couldn't get the right tone on set, and the actor missed their mark, or perhaps there was a problem with the edit. That's happened before where they planned out a certain shot and they couldn't get it, and so it's like now we need something else. And so oftentimes, because the composer is last in the process, they like we can help production solve some of those problems that they have. And I definitely would emphasize that a little bit more, that because it's not just adding music, it's we're integral, like we're solving issues, we're adding emotion where maybe it just wasn't there. Yeah, there's a lot of that kind of thing that we bring.
Yeah, maybe we could shift over into this next segment here, something on day in the life, and it kind of continues on what we've just been speaking about. You already mentioned the spotting session, like that would be an element to your workflow, I suppose. But, generally speaking, I'm sure this varies based on the project, based on the genre, based on the creative direction that each project, has or the director has. But generally speaking, what would be a workflow for you in the course of a day or a week?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's difficult because, like you said, every project's different. And it also depends on like how many projects you're working on at the same time, and sort of like multitasking, and whether or not you have a team that you're working with, of course. So, like I said, almost every project starts with a spotting session, but it might all like after that, I usually go to a period of research. So almost it doesn't matter what type of project it is. Like I do a lot of documentaries and a lot of period pieces. And so I do a lot of listening and sort of researching the style, genres, different geographies, what kind of folk music is coming from different places. And that's one of the things that I really love about this job, is that every project's different and needs a bit of a, different musical language every time. And so I love this part of the process.
Yeah.
And so sometimes, depending on how the spotting session went, like sometimes a filmmaker may already have what's called a temp score, which is where they've taken existing music and they've sort of laid it in. And that's can be really good because it's a great way for them to say, oh, well, this is kind of what I was thinking, in terms of how the music flows. And you can have lots of conversations about, okay, what works about this? Do you like how fast it is? How it swells here, like what it does emotionally. But sometimes it's also a big problem because temp scores can often, if you listen to something too many times, then you're like, oh, this is what my project needs. And sometimes it's like, I remember having, discussions with directors about, okay, well, you put this song in here and, it's a very specific song. Why did you choose this? Well, it's because of some experience I had in high school. I remember this time. And it's like, okay, well, this isn't something that is generic to the audience. Like the
Yeah.
general audience isn't going to have had that
Yeah.
unique experience. And so maybe we should try and find something else. And those conversations can be hard. But I do the same thing as well, where once I've done some research and things like that, sometimes I'll send music to a director and be like, so what do you think of this idea, or like this tone? What do you think of these instruments? That kind of thing. And of course, sometimes I don't do that and I'll just go straight to like sketching themes and ideas. And again, sending them lots of back and forth. The technical tools are really good for helping to work with film. So I know I get this a lot. Oh, well, do you write on piano, or like how does the actual composition happen? And that I mean, I tend to write everything in the computer. It's not romantic. Everybody thinks, oh, well, you're going to be sitting there with a pencil, and
Right, 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 right.
sometimes I do that. Depending on the type of music, I'll go away and I'll sketch some ideas and I'll come back. But ultimately, the great thing about computers is that you can load your project, your visuals, your film into the computer so that you can write at the same time as the film is playing. And that, like, if you need to have something happen at a very specific moment,
Yeah.
you can make sure that that falls right either on a beat or sort of, yeah. And you can set up your, like, the speed of the music so that you get there at the
Yeah.
right time.
Yeah, it
Yeah,
shouldn't
that's
surprise me, but all the same, it still kind of is. Yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
well, before, they were, the music programs that we use today, before those were really what they are, composers used to have these books of tempos. And essentially, they would have to go and they would have to calculate with their calculators. If they want to hit this amount of time at the, it's like they need, especially if the music's going to have a certain beat, they'd have to calculate, okay, well, it's going to take this long to get there at this tempo. So yeah, it was pretty incredible. I'm terrible at math. I don't know that I could have done that.
It sounds like a bit of a nightmare. Yeah, yeah, I hear you on that one. Yeah, it strikes me as like layered, like really, really layered. And again, something you've already raised is this point of communication and, getting back to the director's vision and, them putting in these sort of like temp music. And I was thinking there that like at times maybe as a director, maybe they're putting that in and they think, well, this is roughly where I'd like to go. But by doing so, they're almost setting it up for themselves that like this is what I expect at times in a way. And it must be a bit of a challenge there, depending on the person, perhaps, like when you're producing something else and you're like, well, that's what you put in there. But like as you've already said, like that might not be, general enough for an audience. It's something that's relating to you and your experiences. And that's what's interesting about music, right? I mean, we all sort of like have these really sort of personal experiences and we soundtracks of our own lives. And whether we're consciously aware of this at times, we sort of like set things up that way. So when you're trying to like set creative directions based off of your experiences or what you think the audience is going to be tuned in, but then, there's some creative differences based on, the person who ultimately calls the shots, it must be a bit of a challenge at times. It must be difficult. I think that was the word that you used.
Yeah, well, I mean, it definitely is a challenge, but I think that ultimately, if everything is like if everything you do is based on the story and the perspective of this story, so if you can justify, okay, I used this thing here because of this in the story. I think that is sort of, I think that helps to
It
reduce a
wins
lot
out.
of, yeah, yeah, because I know sometimes, especially early in their careers, composers can get really precious about what it is they write. And I've also been in the same spot where you're like, "Oh, this is the most beautiful melody I've ever written." And then the director's like, "What is this?
Yeah.
That doesn't work all over my film." You're like, "Okay." And your job is to say, "Okay, great. What doesn't work about it? How can we fix this? How can we change this? Let's make it better. Let's make it so it serves that story." And that can be really hard to be like, "Okay, so the best melody I've ever written is now in the trash bin."
Yeah,
Of
yeah,
course, you
yeah,
can
yeah, yeah.
always pull it out and use it on something else, but yeah, it's about knowing. Yeah. Now, of course, I've also worked with some directors who've made some suggestions and we try it and they're like, "Oh, actually your way is better." So, sometimes it helps to acknowledge what it is that their perspective is, but ultimately you're also the professional and you've got the experience of doing this.
Yeah,
So,
exactly.
yeah.
Exactly. And I guess return to that point of communication, right? How well you're able to kind of communicate these ideas and the reasons for the choices that are being made can sort of like serve the ultimate end goal there. So, yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
Well,
absolutely.
yeah. Why don't we shuffle into this next segment, something called pathways? And this one's here is set up to kind of illustrate that, most times, at least from my experience in having, guests on this program, that I think a lot of people might assume that individuals have this vision of where they want to go in their careers and they just beeline straight towards it. In most cases, though, there's some jaunts off to the left, to the right. And I'd be curious about your background a little bit. We've already touched upon it lightly. I'm a music therapist. You were formally trained within that sphere. But even going back beyond that, I'm wondering, like, in your childhood, I'm guessing music was a part of it, certainly. But I'm guessing, like, or I'm wondering rather, like, had we, say, for example, had we met in our youth, would I be somebody thinking, like, oh, Janelle is definitely headed for a career within music? Like, there's no ifs, ands, or buts. She's going to somehow be in there. Or is it sort of something that just naturally evolved and maybe some guidance or formative experiences along the way? Maybe you could tell listeners a little bit about that.
Yeah, so my childhood music was very much a part of it. It was a very big part of it. In fact, I studied the organ in a group music class. It was very contemporary, so we used a lot of familiar music, 50s and 60s music, swing, Latin tangos, polkas, all that kind of stuff. It was really great for me to be in a group lesson too because it was making music together, and we all had this like competitive streak to us. We all wanted to be really good. So but I found that throughout, even through my high school years, music was the thing that I always came back to. Like, when I wasn't feeling good about, being at school or something like that, I could always come home and play, and it was always very, for me, it was kind of healing. And so the hardest thing, though, is, and I feel like this is very common in a lot of creative industries, is that where is the job? So you love this thing, but how do you make a career of it when there isn't a clearly defined career path? When I was interested in becoming a composer, there was no, you go to films, like the school that specializes in film music or game music. You like that wasn't an option, especially in Canada at the time. And so you have to figure out, okay, well, what skills do I need and where do I find those skills? And then who's going to hire me? Like, how do I connect with people that are hiring? Because very few job posts. And usually those that are posting are people who are also new to the industry and haven't made a network yet of people who are also going to hire them. So, yeah, it can be tough to navigate.
It sounds like. So you had this vision, correct me if I'm wrong here, but you had this vision from a young age that like you wanted to go into screen composing, or was that an idea that sort of just came about in sort of researching like what could I do within music or
So I didn't actually really think of screen composing until a bit later. So when I was in high school, I went on a family trip down to Universal Studios, and we went to like we were on a soundstage, and they were talking about music, and my sister turned to me and she's like, "Oh, I could see you doing this." And I'm like, "Hmm, yeah." But I grew up in Saskatchewan, which is in the middle of Canada. It's there's not a lot of filmmaking that happens there because the population is small. It's mostly yeah, yeah. It's not one of the major production centers, let's just say. And so for me, going from there, it's like, okay, well, how did these worlds, collide? How does this work? And it wasn't until after I studied music therapy and I was doing my internships and things, and I knew it was a very emotionally taxing profession. Like it's really hard to be a therapist. And so I was thinking about, okay, so if I don't just do this, what else can I also be doing? Something that's also, using my creative outlet. And I'd always been writing music and I loved that. But yeah, I managed to connect with another composer who had been a teacher at university. And it was really great because he got me connected with a long time sort of mentor of mine. And so I was able to actually see what the industry was and be able to sort of, sit in on meetings, get to hear, how people talk about music and go to recording sessions and things like this and really get a feel for what the industry was. So
mm,
that was yeah, a really good thing. But yeah, it was well after university. Mhm.
okay, okay. Like I'm just thinking here off the top of my head, I mean, music therapy and what you've already explained thus far in the conversation, it would seem that there would be crossover there. There'd be skills that you would have been able to take from that type of education into the work that you're doing right now. Is that fairly accurate or?
Yeah, yeah. I would say so. A lot of music therapy and a lot of what I feel like I personally gained from doing that kind of work was being able to understand a lot of nonverbal communication and being very much aware of sort of how people communicate without using words. And I feel like so when I watch a scene, one of the things I look for is like there's always that moment where a character makes a decision that's going to affect the rest of either the scene or the movie. And it's like that crinkle of their eye or like where the corner of their mouth sort of moves up a little bit and you're like,
Right.
aha, that
Subtlety.
moment is it. And so like musically, well, this is where everything changes, right? So I do feel like I bring a lot of that kind of thing to the work that I score, but also to like there was a lot of other sorts of I mean obviously there's other sorts of skills that we learned as music therapists. And I do think that there's also like part of the whole like research skills that I have and sort of maybe how I approach some of the communication might be a little bit different. Yeah.
Yeah, it just kind of gives you a different vantage point on it all, which then ultimately sort of gives you a different sort of angle to approaching it and making your work special, I'm guessing. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I would think so. Mhm.
Okay. All right. All right. Well, we do have a few more questions here that I would personally like to cover here, and so maybe we could just dive into this Q&A discovery. We can basically continue this back and forth, and getting back to I guess the flow of what you do. And you've already spoken about this lightly, but I've read in researching for this that some screen composers will come in towards the end of the project, and I think that's what you've mentioned already. But on the other hand, I did read that some are there throughout a production. So they might be viewing and participating, within the project as it is being produced. And I'm sure there's certain advantages of doing so. And, maybe doing it the other way is going to present its own unique advantages and disadvantages. And again, it's going to vary project to project, medium to medium. What are your experiences in both approaches?
Yeah, well, obviously, a lot of times people bring on a composer right at the end of a project. As you know, it's done being shot, and they're editing it, and they're like, "Oh, we need music. Oh, I guess we need somebody."
Yeah.
um, but that actually isn't such a bad thing because there's a lot of like the film can change a lot from the script stage to what's actually been shot and what's actually been edited. Like there's three different films there potentially, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I like to really do the bulk of my work once the picture is finished. So they finish the edit. The timing isn't going to change. They might still have visual effects or sound effects and things like that to add, maybe color correction, but the actual timeline isn't going to change. And that's like the perfect thing for a composer because music is time based. So if you are still taking out a second here, a second there, it doesn't sound like a lot, but it can totally change everything for how music flows. That seems to be more and more of a luxury these days. Yeah, so there's there's a couple other times in which it's very common to bring on a composer. So first of all, like right away in the funding stage, that's a big time to sometimes attach a composer. And the benefit of that is that, especially here in Canada, there are tax credits that are applicable to hiring Canadian talent. And so having a Canadian composer attached right away can guarantee that, doesn't matter sort of, yeah, it can definitely apply to you being able to certify your production as being Canadian, which gets you a certain level of tax credits,
Yeah.
or even just yeah, and it's helpful for funders. The next time, of course, is in pre-production. If there's going to be music that needs to be played on screen, something that's already needs to be written, sometimes it helps to bring on your composer early. Sometimes this is the role of a music supervisor to facilitate, but on a lot of like more smaller independent productions, sometimes the composer might be writing something, and then also like on-set coaching of actors. I've done that. So where you have somebody who doesn't actually know how to play an instrument and you're like, okay, we're going to teach you how to take it.
There you go. Back to the role of
um,
having wearing many hats, I suppose. Yeah.
yeah. But ultimately, the more time you have with the film, the more back and forth you can have. I know that's one great thing about games is that I'm often brought in quite early. Sometimes there's some concept art, but there usually isn't anything I can play. So it's all about those creative discussions and seeing sort of like the tone and texture and knowing more about the style of gameplay is really important. So yeah, but I do hear that there's a lot more at the high levels. People are like, "Whoa, well, I understand that composers are, they start right at the script and they start writing all the score, when they have a script in their hands." And it's like, yeah, but they usually have a budget that's like 5 or 6 times what I'm getting. They can devote the time to writing things that probably won't end up in the film. I don't have that
Rework it at
luxury
the end.
when
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, and it depends too, like, that doesn't happen in television, because the timeline's so fast, like, you have to be churning out an episode. Like, there's a new episode every week if it's on traditional television, like, you don't have that
It's a
luxury.
machine, right? Yeah, exactly. You've got to
Yeah,
fit your work in there and fit it in within their timeline. So like, yeah, okay, it makes sense. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, yeah. It's yeah, really, really interesting in that sense because like when I was asking that question, I could see it from both angles. Where like, yeah, if you're involved right out of the gate, you can sort of see like the vision and where things are going. But the practicalities of what you were just explaining there, I mean, sometimes it just doesn't line up. Like you need to come in at the end when things are settled and okay, this is it. This is the timing. Okay, now we're ready for the music. So yeah, it's really interesting
yeah.
to hear both perspectives on that and times where, both approaches might be used depending on the project. Okay. I have this other question, and it hinges on this notion of inspiration. Like any artist, it's a big part of what you do, I'm sure. You have to be brimming with inspiration yourself to be putting your best work out there. And I'm guessing here that at times, like when you're working across so many different genres, whether it's in video games, television, film, you're getting pulled in a lot of different directions or different demands that you were just speaking of. And that unto itself must be rewarding. That must allow you to kind of stretch your own creative boundaries, which unto itself can then, lead to inspiration, maybe. If you're just doing the same thing over and over and over again, that could be a bit of a drain. But the line of work that you're doing or you have been doing, being involved in so many different types of projects might, ostensibly, be a source of inspiration for you and keep you going. But, maybe you could speak to that. I'd love to hear what you have to say about that.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I love about this job is that every project's different, and I'm always getting to try new things. And I think that that sense of, I mean, yeah, that sense of finding that new sound or just a different approach to take maybe to storytelling. I think that that's really inspiring. I personally get a lot of inspiration from what it is I'm working on. So whether it's the story and characters or like the texture of the film and how it's edited or the style of animation in the game, like is it going to be a line drawing, is it going to be soft like watercolors, is it like yeah, even is the film going to be in black and white? Is it going to be in sepia? Is it going to be really hyper realistic or lots of blue tones? Like those sorts of things is sort of where I draw a lot of inspiration from.
Hmm.
But I think most people in creative fields, this is a hard thing because you can't wait for inspiration to strike. You have to get into you have to get into the practice of creating regardless of whether there's inspiration or not. And that can be tough. That can definitely be tough. So it's like I know like a lot of writers talk about doing their morning pages. I think that's something that was from the writer's way. Wait, the artist's way. Yes, the artist's way. It's a book, and talking about how to get through writer's block. And so essentially, it's like 3 pages of whatever comes to mind just to get you
Right.
writing.
Right.
And I feel like sometimes like I also sort of dabble in other sorts of arts as a place to work on those creative muscles, whether it's drawing or painting. I've done stained glass, I've done silversmithing, all sorts of different kinds of artist or arts, I guess. And I feel like even sometimes like starting the day with a little creativity, something that just puts me in the mood to play a little bit, like that's
Yeah, it's really interesting. Yeah, yeah. I
mhm.
mean, I just had a guest on the program not too long ago. He's an industrial designer, designing products, from scratch, and also too. I mean, certainly within that line of work, creativity is, it's a major, major part of what he does. And we got in this discussion about how that type of work or any type of work involving artistry, like the world that you live within, the professional sphere, is really truly blended with your personal. Like it has to be almost in a way, right? You have to be deriving sources of inspiration from, your daily life, like what you were just speaking of, some of your other hobbies that are off to the side. Whether you're consciously aware of these things or not, like they feed into that creative sort of outlet. Whereas like another type of profession, say you're a business development manager for a big company, I mean, you can sort of detach, say on the weekends. All right, I've done my Monday to Friday, 9 to 5, 9 to 6, whatever it is. All right, I can just go off and pursue whatever I want to do on the weekends. Whereas like within artistry, I think like these worlds, as I just said, like the word that keeps coming to mind is like a blend. It really is a blend. And it almost has to be in a way to like you said, sort of exercise these creative muscles and, creative sort of like inputs that you can then transfer into your professional sphere. I don't, am I onto anything on that? Does that sort of ring true for you, would you say? Or,
Yeah, absolutely. I think it also helps to have a lot of things in your toolbox from which to draw from, especially when you are sort of like, "Ooh, what do I write next?" If you can go to your little, toolbox of ideas and pull something out and be like, "Okay, let's try this or use this," or, like I think that helps, and I think you only get to have a full toolbox from regular creating.
yeah, experience and just finding out what works for you, I suppose, right? And I guess that's my last point on this too. I find really interesting is that like a lot of people would probably assume that being an artist or being involved in artistry, you don't have structure, right? There isn't structure. But from my experience in speaking with people like yourself, very much so, there is structure. It's just like, like you just said, like a toolbox of things that you can do to help, break these cycles that aren't exactly helping you out or getting you in the right state of mind to produce. So there is structure involved there to allow you to flourish, essentially. Is that right? Would that be accurate?
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. All right. I've got this other question here too. We are moving on a fairly nice clip here. And then this was one that sort of got me when I was immersing myself or trying to immerse myself into your world. That this relates to the reward of what you're doing, I guess. And again, we've spoken to this point a couple times over, but like artistry as a whole, you're creating something from nothing. So there's got to be some reward when you do put something together that at least you're proud of. And hopefully it produces that type of reaction, from others who were equally pleased with it. But when that happens, it must be a rewarding experience. So I thought about that. But then as I dug deeper into this thought, it's kind of struck me that, like, say with your work, screen composing, there is this whole other team that's producing this other piece of art, whether it's a video game, whether it's, a scene within a film, television, and that unto itself is creating emotion. It's emoting, right? And creating some sort of feeling in others. And then you're interlacing your artistry with that of somebody else's or a team's. And that unto itself, now, of course, if done well, is going to create this whole other reaction in people. And again, I mean, it's all obvious, I guess, if you're thinking about this right now and I'm speaking it out. But at the same time, I think like when you're in the moment, and maybe early on in your career, like when these things happen and they all come together and you're part of it and you produce this, it must be just out of this world, that experience. And I'd love to hear what you've got to say about that.
Oh, it's definitely the best feeling.
Yeah, it's got to
I
be.
often, I often really get this sort of like excited moment a couple of times during the production cycle. Once is, like especially if you have this moment where you're like, "Ooh, I really got to find this perfect thing," and you're trying, and oh, that doesn't work. So you try something else. Oh, that doesn't work. But when you find the thing, it's like,
Yeah,
ah,
yeah,
like that,
yeah.
a total awe moment. And I have to admit, there's something really, really special when you get to work with like live musicians as well. Like that moment right there is pretty incredible as well. And just hearing the notes you wrote for that first time, you're like, oh, chills.
Right, right,
But
right.
I also really love being able to celebrate the work that I've done with other people. So often, I'm working on something by myself in my studio space. And when I actually get to, go to a film festival and like really celebrate the work with an audience and hear people reacting, and like that is so special and meaningful. And that was something that we just haven't gotten over that much over the last couple of years with the pandemic. But it really is a group sport.
Yeah, you must really notice that having that break in there induced by the pandemic and whatnot, and noticing what you kind of lost there, and noticing that feeling that it produced for you, getting back into these group viewing sessions when a project is done, and then like leaning over your shoulder and, all right, here's a moment that I really put a lot into. Like, okay, what's the reaction going to be? And having a look over there and like and seeing that and having it hit the way you'd imagined, it must be special.
Yeah. Oh, that definitely is special for sure.
Yeah. Philosophically speaking, I mean, the work itself must be meaningful to you on so many different levels that, yeah, quite fulfilling career, I guess, once you fully immerse yourself into it all.
Yes.
Well, why don't we shift into this middle segment here, something a water cooler story segment, and I'd love to hear what you have for us. It's basically a segment where I just ask, guests to indulge listeners with the story relating to the profession. So, yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, I just recounted how meaningful it is to have music performed by live musicians, and the reason why I think I pull that out as being so meaningful of an experience is because it takes resources and skills to obviously get to that point. Not every project has the money to put into that level of production, unfortunately. And I mean, sometimes too, you're dealing with time constraints, or you just decide to do a specific, something electronic because that suits the style of the project. So, but yeah, I remember there's this. So I'm part of the Screen Composers Guild of Canada, which is a national trade organization that represents professional composers and producers of music for screen. And one of their mandates is professional development. And I I was lucky enough to be chosen to have one of my orchestral pieces performed and recorded by a live orchestra as part of an educational program. Yeah, and this was particularly special because I'd been working with a game developer who had some musical background. I think had been a trumpet player. And so we'd been working on a game, and I decided to realize one of the pieces of music for orchestra and invited him to come as well. And that, like, just hearing it being played, not only did I get chills, but I think it was super, super meaningful for them as well. Because all of a sudden it was like, okay, well, we'd been, doing things in the box, but all of a sudden to have it like that, it's like, wow, this is real music and it's really good music. And
Yeah.
like it just totally changed the whole dynamic, I think. Yeah, yeah. But again, like I was in the sound booth at the time, and like just hearing the music come through the speakers for the first time. It's like you're supposed to be taking notes, right? Because
Yeah.
you're working. You want to get a really
Yeah.
good recording, and you're supposed to, like, you're supposed to take notes with what's going well, what's not. Like, did you get this part? Did you not get this part? And it's like that first playthrough, you're like, like the entire time you're like, oh, this is so good. I can't focus on anything. So then of course you have to play it again.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But it,
um,
like that. Sorry, go ahead. Yeah, yeah.
no, it's okay.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, like, that's it though. Like that's what's getting me through this whole conversation is like it's evoking this emotion in people, right? And like that's what music does inherently, right? It's that. And when you're putting it together in such a way that it's done well, and certainly like based off of your background, again, I read off the top and all of your accomplishments, like a lot of what you've done is at a very high level. So certainly it's producing these moments for not only yourself, but for others as well. And it's just, yeah, I don't know, just the nature of music, as I just said, is one thing. But then when it's being performed at such a level, it's bound to like create these emotions in people and to really set moods and everything else. So yeah.
Yeah, I think very, very much. And I think those first experiences, like, that was, one of my first experiences having something performed by an orchestra. And I know, like, later on, I did a feature film where I recorded with a string quartet for the first time. It's like these little, moments, like the first time I recorded with a guitarist, or like this kind of thing. It's like those moments really stay with you
Yeah, it have to.
throughout your career. And I think you get sustained by that feeling, or at least I know I do. Yeah.
Well, our last segment is upon us. It is a crystal ball segment, as the name implies. We're looking towards the future trends, predictions, so on and so forth. And it feels like pretty much every conversation I've had in the last like 3 months has been like tracking back to this topic of AI. And for obvious reasons, I mean, it's disrupting a lot of industries. It's quite compelling to talk about. There's a lot of emotion involved in that, certainly. And I don't doubt that at some point, maybe even now, I don't know, AI is creeping into your industry and what you're doing. But I'd love to hear it from you as far as like in what ways maybe these mighty AI algorithms are still up against it when competing against somebody like yourself, or a human who's actually putting together music to match a moment, to match a feeling, to match some creative artistry or direction. What would you say to this and the rise of AI within your field?
Well, I mean, I talked earlier about some of the technology that I use on a regular basis and how that's actually changed the industry for the better. So, I know initially, like anything that a new tool, like when the internet first came out, the music industry freaked out because it's like, how do I make money with the internet? And you've got Napster and all that kind of stuff. Well, obviously, we're sort of figuring that out with technology to make screen scoring easier. Well, in my program that I use to write music, I can say, okay, I want to hit this point and this point and this point. Give me what tempo I need. And it'll say, oh, well, you should have a tempo that goes like this, da, 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 right? So
Yeah.
that's AI, the way I look at it. Where I sort of see AI being problematic in the screen scoring industry is that it's really good at just making up stuff that sounds a lot like what's already there, right? So there's a lot of music that is used in shows where it's generic. It's there. It's wallpaper. I hate to say it, but there's composers who write a lot of music for production libraries, for example, and then editors pull this music and place it into shows. And I mean, it requires a lot of work for a composer, but there are people who eventually, can make a lot of money, but you have to write a lot of music to make this business model work. But the challenge for music editors is that it's like you still need to make it fit to the picture. And I think that's where AI might be able to help that, like solve that challenge. But I am worried that a lot of composers, like the entry point for composers is usually, working on low budget things, working in, oftentimes, especially if people like, depending on their background, they might work on specific types of projects that I'm going to say are formulaic. Like every Hallmark movie kind of sounds about the same. A lot of the
Yeah.
Lifetime movies, for example, also kind of sort of sound the same. There's these sorts of things where I feel like that's going to be the first target. And unfortunately, if they stop hiring composers, then where is the sort of entry place for
Yeah.
composers?
Yeah. Where do they gain that
Like,
experience and the skills,
yeah,
right?
because AI isn't coming for the top. They're not coming for John Williams. They're not coming,
Yeah.
coming
Right.
for,
Right. Right.
some of those people that bring really specialized skills that are really sought after. They're not coming for the people who are creating that brand new sound because AI can't create something from nothing. Like they can't come up with something brand new at this point. Really, it can only really recreate based on what it's given to learn from, right? So it's going to take a while to get to that point, but I think, if those entry jobs aren't available, how do composers get to that place where they are able to be hired? And especially if then it's harder to get that initial experience. Like I know there's a lot of stuff that's being made, but there's not a lot of good paying jobs, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So
I
it's
hear you.
like
I
you
hear you.
have to, like, to get started, you have to be taking a lot of work and really building up your reel and building up those experiences. So that's what I
Yeah.
worry about.
Okay. Yeah. It's an area I definitely wouldn't have considered. I mean, again, being a layperson, I just would have assumed that, maybe we're not there yet, in terms of AI coming in and just producing works for film and whatnot. But it's that point, that entry point. And if they steal away those lower end jobs, then yeah, where are we going to be? How are people going to train themselves up? How are they going to get to that point where they can become like a John Williams, where they've built up, this amount of experience and learned by trial and error, trial and error, trial and error. They're not given those opportunities. Yeah. Like how is that going to affect things 5, 10 years down the road? Some of the artistic creations we're putting out there are going to suffer. Is that kind of on the track that we're on? And yeah, I can see how that would be a bit of a concern. So yeah, yeah. Well, time will tell, I suppose. And I guess that's kind of what's compelling about it all right now is like the rules of the game within AI, within all these industries and professions. It's just moving so quickly that matters such as these aren't being, at least my perspective, aren't necessarily being addressed or taken care of in such a manner that we're going to be able to, I don't know, manage it all, 5-10 years down the line, as I just said. So yeah, utterly compelling, but a little bit frightful too in the same breath. So anyway. Yeah, I must say though, like we've just flown through this conversation. I feel like we just got started here, but to me, it's always a mark of a good conversation. And I must say, like, what a joy it's been to speak to you about all of this. I've truly enjoyed it, and I can't tell you how grateful I am for you taking some time and joining the show today.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me.
Well, for those interested in learning more about Janelle, of course, you can find her on LinkedIn. You can also find her on some of her other socials at Janelle Music. She's on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. And for reference, all this information will be included in the show notes. And if you like today's show, please be sure to tell a friend and share. That helps way more than you can know. You can also rate, review, and subscribe wherever you access your podcasts. And lastly, I would definitely encourage you to head on over to YouTube. I did launch a channel in the last year over there, and I do have video highlight compilations of the talk. So you can take it in from that perspective. And if you're there, I would really appreciate if you hit the like or subscribe button. That is the only way that YouTube knows that content matters. And yeah, you'll notice right away. I mean, that channel needs a bit of love. So yeah, hit subscribe, hit like, really would appreciate it. And finally, don't forget to join us on the next episode of Life as A, where we'll continue to explore and unearth the details of professions and the people behind them. I'm your host, Christopher Schoenwald. Until next time, stay curious about life and living.